All right, welcome back. And today we get to talk about pathogen and plant diseases, which is kind of ironic to what we are dealing with in society right now. And one of the things that I want you to know is that plant diseases and plant pathology and all of that is the same with plants than it's for people. So throughout the many years that I've been working with plants, I have dealt with many epidemics on plants. We have dealt with insects that devastate plants, and we have dealt with diseases that are devastating plants. And all of those are important because they can be detrimental to our economy, as it is right now, with our own disease. And because California is an agriculture state. So all of whatever disease may happen to be here may affect our agriculture. The same thing is happening, except that now it is a virus, a disease that is afflicting humans, and we call it COVID-19. Right now, with plants, we are dealing with the citrus greening, which was also introduced from China. It's affecting citrus, oranges, and lemons, and limes, and all of those. And it's destroying the fruit. It's not detrimental, but in the case of agriculture, it could be definitely be a problem. But now let's look at diseases on plants. So we're going to be covering some of them, such as powdery mildew, very common to see it out there. We're going to have certain blights, very rapid death on plants that are going to be out there. We're going to have some diseases that are going to cause some kind of leaf spot. We're going to have a twig blight or shoot blight, so rapid death. We're going to see some cankers, dead areas within plants that are going to be places where the pathogen may be sleeping or overwinter and then infects later on. We're going to see some diseases that happen to affect the vascular system of the plant, causing what is known as wilts. And then we're going to see some things that are called galls, which can be equate to tumors for humans, but in plants they're not detrimental. So some kind of galls growth on a plant. And then we're going to see some kind of root, or there could be possible some root infections, such as Fusarium wilts or pathogens that are going to be affecting the roots. So just like humans, every single part of the plant can be affected by a disease at some point or another. We've already talked about nematodes, or we've shown nematodes before. So nematodes are considered a pathogenic organism. So most of the in agriculture, they are considered a pathogenic, even though it is caused by a worm. So just be aware of that. And I've shown some of these photographs to you before about the nematodes. But when we are going to be looking at the infection of a disease, there are three very important components that are necessary. And so this is for human diseases and plant disease as well. So this is referred to as the disease triangle. And the three components must be present in order for the disease to develop. So the first thing is that we are going to need a susceptible host. Now, one of the things that I want to point out right now is that plant diseases do not really jump to people because we are not a host for plant diseases. We have our own diseases. And likewise, human or animal diseases do not jump onto plants because they're too far apart. However, when organisms are closely related, as in mammals, there is the possibility of some of the diseases being shared. And that is where we're dealing with a virus that would normally be found on a bat that happened to find a human as a host, and all of a sudden it became a really bad thing. And so the host has to be susceptible. And if it's not susceptible, then nothing is going to happen. It is also during this part of the triangle where people can actually do something to stop the disease or slow it down. And that is going to be through the use of resistant varieties. So you may have heard or you may hear plants that are resistant to a specific disease. So people keep selecting, breeding, hybridizing individuals to make them resistant to a disease. There is no such thing as immunity. We can just put that stronger individual out there that'll survive for many years until eventually he may succumb, and then by that time we have something new. So here we have a susceptible host. We have a disease known as fire blight that is going to be out there. If you go outside and walk around, you may encounter an evergreen pear. Pears are extremely susceptible to this disease. And so it only affects pears, quinces, Raphiolepis, and a few other members of the rose family, and that's it. So only those individuals are susceptible to this disease, and it's not going to affect anything else. The next thing is the environment. The environment that is either going to favor the disease, where it's then going to become problematic, or it's going to favor the host, where the host immune system may be stronger, that is able to defend itself and then slow the disease, development of the disease. So the environment needs to be favored for one or the other. So this is where we have no control. If we have a lot of rain, that is going to cause a problem. It's going to put the plants under some kind of stress, making them susceptible to the disease. And so a lot of rain could potentially switch the balance to the pathogen, and then it's going to attack the plant. Flooding, we have no control over this. Too cold, we have no control over this. Too hot, we have no control over this. So the environmental factors, we have no control over. We have control over the plant by resistant variety. And the last thing is going to be the pathogen. The pathogen needs to be here. And so if the pathogen is not here, then the plant can be live its life for years without having any disease problem. And there's going to be a lot of plants that were miracle in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and later on a disease was introduced and it devastated those plants, and you can no longer find them around here. So that has happened many, many, many times. So once the pathogen gets introduced, then the pathogen finds the host that is susceptible, and depending on the environment, now we have the complete triangle. Now we have a disease, an epidemic, or some kind of disease development. So what's very important for you to understand is that 90% of the plant's diseases that you may encounter are going to be caused by a fungi. So we have plant diseases that are going to be caused by fungi, by bacteria, by viruses, the same thing that are going to be afflicting humans, we're going to have them afflicting plants. So fungi are going to be the majority of the organisms that are going to cause problems on plants. Having said this, like everything we've seen before, there's going to be good fungi that are going to be helpful to plants. We call those mycorrhiza. There's going to be bad fungi that are going to be afflicting or causing disease on plants. There's going to be free-living fungi that are just going to be doing their job in rotting organisms, and they're not going to be bothering plants. So just be aware of this so that you don't just start blaming organisms, calling them bad. The other thing that is very important for you to understand is that the fungi are going to reproduce to a spore, which is a type of seed. The seed is going to land in some kind of nice substrate, the leaf litter, the twigs, and everything else. And they're going to germinate like any seeds. And then you're going to have a mycelium. The mycelium is going to be the real body of the fungi. The mycelia is going to grow through the substrate. They're going to digest the organic matter, and that's what they're going to consume. At a certain point during the season, the plant, it wants to reproduce. And so you're going to have the creation of a mushroom. So the mushroom is nothing more than an organism for creating spores and dispersing spores, which is going to be equivalent to a flower and a fruit on a plant. So it's just a minor thing. The real organism is going to be the mycelium that is going to be below the ground, usually in some shade or away from drying out. So when you look at some substrate and you see this white filaments, that is the mycelium. So here it is growing out of a twig that I managed to pull out. So you can see it with your naked eyes if you scrape some of the organic matter. They don't like drying out, so they want moisture. And so that's where you're going to find them underneath, below the substrate, where it's going to be away from the sun and kind of cool and moist. We have a few other organisms out there that are often blamed for being bad, but they're not. This is Septoria Figaloseptica, which is the slime mold. So there is such a thing as a slime mold, a fungi that at certain point in their life is going to have a slug stage. The slug stage are just going to kind of creep out of the substrate. They're going to congregate and they can move through an area. So sometimes they'll come out of the substrate and move onto a walkway or onto lawn or some other structure. And so it is not uncommon for people to think that there's some kind of weird monster coming out of the ground. So it's nothing more than a slime mold. Is it pathogenic? No. All you gotta do is take a hose and wash it down, it goes away. But if you just let it be, over time, it's going to just dry out, and this is where it's gonna create its spores. The common name for this is dog vomit slime mold, because apparently when it dries out, it looks like the vomit of a dog. I don't know. But eventually it's just going to create this crust, and you can see all of this brownish area. That would be the spores that will create new slime molds when they fly out and they land in a nice substrate and they germinate. So slime molds, not a problem. Some of them are going to be small, and so here we have some slime mold that create some small mushroom-like thing. So this is the spore-bearing structure coming out of the substrate. Here's this side view of one. And so this one happened to crawl on a leaf. And when people see something like this, they think it's a disease. They send me the pictures. And obviously, it's just a slime mold. Here's another one that happened to crawl onto this celery or cilantro. And it just happened to sporulate or have the spore-bearing structures on top of that. Not a problem, just cut the leaf, wash it, it's gonna go away. Here's a fungi that is known as witch's butter. Completely harmless. If you happen to see it, comes out of the substrate. Or you can just wash it away, no problem. Here is the stink horns. And this unfortunately have a resemblance to a penis, and it is very common for people to say that there's penis growing out of the ground. It's a stinkhorn, it's a fungi, it's living off of the substrate, completely harmless. If you don't want to see it, just break it away, it goes away. But it's going to come out in the ground, and many people don't expect it, and they get frightened by it. And I get phone calls every single year. Or there's going to be some of the puffballs. The puffballs are the fruiting structures for the mycorrhiza fungi, which are the good fungi. And so they're going to be very common around many trees or other plants. So just let them be. Very nice activities for you to blow on this puffball when it's very dry, and let's just let the spores fly out. So puffballs are going to be not pathogenic. And there's going to be a few other mushrooms that happen to have some other interest, being our morels here, which is the second best tasting mushroom in the world. So this is very good. If you happen to find it, just make sure that it's the right mushroom. before you eat it, but it kind of looks like a brain, but it's very, very good. And we have a few desert mushrooms. So there's going to be mushrooms in the desert. This one I happen to find here in Long Beach. This is a desert uh, stalk mushroom. So coming out of the ivy, I found a nice population. You can see the spores all over, and you can see where it started. And this one I brought out, and then I brought it out to take a photograph. So very uncommon, but if you see them around here, Batteria phalloides, that's the hoity-toity name for this, Batteria phalloides, desert mushroom. Or there's going to be something like the bird nest fungi, which is, once again, completely harmless. It just lives out of the substrate, but it's, when people see it, they don't know what it is. It looks weird, looks like an alien, looks like sea anemones. Or there's going to be what is known as the fairy ring. So these are more of a problem with golf courses. So what happens here is that the mushroom and the fungi is feeding off of the dead debris, the grass and everything else, that eventually may create a layer that is not going to allow water to go in. And so the grass may suffer because of lack of water. So one of the nice things that you can do here is aerate, punch some holes throughout the ground so that that allows the water to go in and the grass will recover. But it's completely harmless, I guess. It's not non-pathogenic, but it's just living there and feeding off of the other organic matter that may cause a problem. But the mushroom itself, fungi itself, is non-pathogenic. And so we have them growing out in the lawn, and you can see here. Or we have a few other mushrooms that are just going to be out there living off of the organic matter. There is, however, a fungi that is going to be problematic, and these are going to be the wood rotting fungi. Their job is to rot wood, and they are going to be one of the few organisms that can digest the lignin and the suber and wood. Very few organisms can do that, except for this fungi. And the problem here is that many of the homes are built out of wood. And a beam from a house or a stump, as you see here, is just dead wood waiting for this fungi to consume. So they are going to be a problem for homes, and or eventually, if it happens to be a tree that is afflicted by disease, it has a lot of dead wood, it can eventually weaken it and cause the tree to fall and fail. But their mushroom or fruiting body is going to be what is known as a conch. And it's going to be more like a half of a disc or a disc that will come out of the stem. So keep in mind that the mycelia, the fungi, is living throughout the entire stem or trunk or wood. And what we're seeing here is just the fruiting body. Here is a different shot, and here's the fruiting body. And what's also important is that the fruiting body is perennial, which means that during certain part of the year, when it's active, it's going to create a new layer, send out the spores. The next year, it's going to create another layer, send out spores, and it can keep adding layers to that conch until it becomes a little bit big or bigger. Underneath the conch is where we have tiny pores, and that is where the spores come out from. Here's that. And so here's a ash tree that I happened to find. The tree looked good, the stem looks intact, but underneath it's telling me something different. Underneath or at the base, we see conchs that have been there for a while. They got wet recently, and that's why they kind of moldy. But I can definitely say that this tree, it's been rotted, slowly rotting or eating the dead wood. Wood rotting fungi do not really attack the living portion of the tree unless the tree is severely weakened by something else, some other stress factor, and or is really dying where it cannot really defend itself, then it can be attacked by it. But otherwise, the wood rotting fungi only feed on the center of the tree, which is considered the dead wood, not the living portion. So a tree can be completely hollowed out as long as it has a good living structure. it can be alive and well for many, 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 many years. So some of the conchs can be colorful, and here you can see an assortment of different conchs at different stages, the newer one here and the old ones towards the bottom. So here's just some different shots. In the fall, if you go out there in a walk, you can find the chicken of the forest. This is a wood rotting fungi, and here you can see it coming out of some kind of wound. So a branch fell here, and so that allowed for the pathogen to colonize. It's sporulating, so you can see this beautiful golden sulfur color mushroom coming out of the stem. And some of the other injured areas, you can see where the mushroom is coming out of. So very nice, very beautiful. Again, people don't want to see it, but it's a good thing. There's the lion's mane fungi. So it just has this filaments. When you touch it, billions of spores are going to come out. And there's a side view of that. And then you have a disease known as anthracnose. Anthracnose is going to be common on sycamores, especially this year when we have some wet season. So that is lending itself to a good anthracnose season. So most of the fungi that we're going to be covering, most of the diseases are going to require some kind of humidity. So fungi don't like drying out, with few exceptions. So when you have humid, wet weather, it's perfect. So anthracnose is going to afflict sycamores. You can kind of see some of the damage here, this white structure, and the leaves is beginning to curl, and the leaves begin to kind of wither away, and then they drop off. So is anthracnose detrimental to the tree? The answer is no. What happens is that during the summer, the tree may completely defoliate, so it may drop all the leaves, and it'll send a second set of leaves in the summer, and then by fall, winter, it's going to drop them again because of the normal cycle, and then it's going to start all over again. So it's just going to be afflicting the leaves to some degree, but it's not going to be detrimental, at least not in the sycamores. So here is some of the leaves as they've been affected and deformed and distorted. So this is the anthracnose fungi. And so here's a few more that have already been misshapen. And here's a few more. So this is a sycamore. This one here is in Akuba, or Japanese Akuba. Now in Akuba, it has a different effect. You're going to have some leaf spots that will become necrotic or dead, so they're going to die. But the disease can walk a little bit more. So here's some leaf spot. So if it happened to also afflict the stem, it will kill it. And this is going to create that canker that we talked about. So you can see right here the boundary between the living tissue and the dead tissue. And so the next year, this could be the source for the new infections. So it is important that when you see something like this, that you cut as many cankers as you can find to minimize a severe infection the following year. So if infected, or if the stem completely gets girdled by the disease, then the entire stem will die. So depending on the plant, the anthracnose may have certain damage or not, as in the case of the sycamores. Then we have some of the powdery mildew. What is very important for you to understand with powdery mildew is every single plant in the world has a powdery mildew. But if we don't see it in California, it's because it has not been introduced. But if you go to the origin of the plants where they were native to, you would find some kind of powdery mildew. Eventually they may get here, but it's just a matter of time. So number one, every plant has a powdery mildew. Number two, powdery mildew is going to be a disease that is going to be host specific. What it means is that the powdery mildew that is affecting roses would only affect roses and or members of the rose family, and that's it. So it's not going to affect crepe myrtle that has its own powdery mildew, or it's not going to affect any other plant other than the roses. The other thing that is important is that powdery mildew is a fungi that is an obligate parasite, which means that it can only feed on a living host, which means that if the plant dies, the powdery mildew will die with it, which means that the powdery mildew does not want to kill the plant. It just wants to feed off of it. It is a parasite. It can cause stress. It can weaken the plant, where then it makes it susceptible for other pathogenic organisms to attack and kill the plant. But powdery mildew is never going to kill its host. It needs a living host. So obligate parasite and host specific, those are two very important words. So the other thing with powdery mildew is that what you're seeing here are the mycelia and the spores and everything outside the leaves. So powdery mildew is completely an external disease. And this is going to be rare. This is the exception where a powdery mildew fungi loves to have dryness. And so one of the nice things that you can do to avoid any kind of powdery mildew problem is to keep the plants, wash your plants, keep them wet, because that's going to make the environment not suitable for the fungi, and it's going to take away the powdery mildew, or it's going to lessen the effects of powdery mildew. So here's Palo Verde, powdery mildew. So again, it's quite recent introduction, but that's a whole different plant. So it's not going to go to roses. And here's some of more severe infection on a flower spike on a rose. And here's a flower bud that is going to be affected by it. So can the powdery mildew distort the flower? Yes. Can the powdery mildew take away some energy from the flower, from a rose, making the flower smaller, maybe not as many? Yes, but it's not going to kill the plant. Plantain with powdery mildew, again, specific to plantains and nothing else. And then also very similar to powdery mildew, but different is going to be the downy mildews. Downy mildews are also host specific, but they're going to be interior. So they're going to be completely inside. So when you see out here, it's going to be just the spores. Downy mildew, this is on grasses. Not really problematic with grasses, but it can affect grapes. And in grapes, because of the grape industry and the wine, it makes it a big problem. But downy mildews are also host specific and obligate parasites. And here's, I think it's a spinach with the downy mildew coming from the inside. And here's a different shot of it, of the spores. And here's some more downy mildews coming out there and there. And then we have the other very popular disease known as rust. Just like powdery mildew, the rust is also an obligate parasite, because rust is going to affect certain plants and not all of them. Just like powdery mildew, every single plant has a rust disease. If you don't see it in California, it's because it hasn't made it yet. So host specific, so the rust that affects oxalis can only affect oxalis. The rust that affects snapdragons can only affect snapdragons. And this is the rust that affects mallows and hollyhocks and lavateras. So this is the mallow rust. And just like powdery mildew, the rust are also going to be obligate parasite. So host specific and obligate parasite, which means that rust will not kill your plant. It needs that living host to keep on living. Unlike powdery mildew, rust are completely systemic. They're inside. And so it is only during the time of the year when it's time for them to send out the spores that you will see some of these clusters that will eventually burst and release the copper color spores. So here is roses. And so here you see underneath the leaves, normally because it's nice and humid, you see the rust spores that are right here. And so the rust infections love humidity. So it is unfortunate with roses that it has both a powdery mildew and it has a rust infection here in California. So one of the reasons that people recommend that you do not water roses late at night is because it raises the humidity and that makes the environment more conducive to a rust infection. So keeping your plants dry makes it a nice environment for powdery mildew. And keeping the plants wet, which takes away the powdery mildew problem, makes it more conducive to rust infections. So on plants like roses, where you have both infections, you have a double problem. But on most other plants that just have a single one, you can manage it better. There is no way to cure it. Knowing that the plants have a powdery mildew or a rust, and they're host specific. So knowing that you're growing roses, you know that you're going to get rust. Knowing that you're growing roses, you know you're going to get powdery mildew. So you can lessen the effect, slow the disease by treating the plant before the spores appear, because you know they're going to be there. You know the plant's already infected with it. When you see all of the spores already popping out of the leaves, it is already too late. The plant has already gone through its cycle. The spores, fungi has gone through its cycle. It's now sporulated and ready to go to sleep. So do spray or do the treatment before this happens so that you can lessen the effect. Eventually, you will get the rust in the spores and the powdery mildew, because as the plant is going to go dormant, the disease is going to be favored by the environment as well. So that was rust, and here is rust anaxalis, again, host specific, its own plant. And very new to us is going to be rust on myrtle or even guava. So this is now affecting myrtles and guavas and any member of the eucalyptus family. So this is, I found like about 2 years ago at the other campus. So it's already here, and we'll see what happens with it. But this is, again, only affecting members of that family. And here's an area that was seriously infected, and there's a few more. And here's one where, again, it's deformed the plant. It was in a greenhouse, it was humid, it has a perfect environment. So yeah, this is a severe rust infection right here. And you can see that all the spores that are just coming out, just distortion and of the plant right there. So hopefully it's not going to get this bad. And here's more oxalis. And actually, this is coffee rust. And then another infection is going to be called smut. And smuts are going to be problematic for corn and grasses. And smut is going to be an infection of the flower. So what happens is that with corn, we have a flower. The corn is the flower of the plant, and the hairs that you see on the corn or the silk, those are going to be the stigma and style. And so the fungi, corn smut fungi, is going to overwinter in the ground, and then during the right season, when the stigmas are going to be receptive, the fungi is going to send out the spores in the air. And the spores are going to behave like pollen. So when they land on the tip of this silk, they are then going to infect, and the infection is going to run through the silk down into the kernel or the grain, individual grain. When it infects it, it's going to distort it. It's going to create this grotesque growth, which is now going to be just a kernel that is going to be full of spores that will eventually drop to the ground and infect the next year. So this is where there's going to be some grotesqueness on it, and distortion and disfiguring of the corn. This is edible. It's a delicacy. Tastes like a mushroom, but it is an infection of the flower that starts with the flower, and then it goes to the seed. So it can almost be a seedling or a seed infection. So a problem with corn, but more important, it's going to be a same kind of mud infection or similar that is going to affect ryegrass, that is going to create ergot and or ergotism. So research ergot, and that is a source of extreme toxins. And unknowingly to people in the old days, they were eating contaminated grains and literally like drugging themselves and kept themselves kind of not in good health because they did not realize that they were eating something that bad. So corn smut, here it is for sale, and people eat it. So you can see the individual grains that have been disfigured and grotesque, and all the black thing that you see here, those are just the spores. And a few other grass flower spikes. So here's a grass, I think this is Bermuda grass, and you can see the distorted flowers now just full of spores. And here you can see the same thing. And here's another one where it's just been completely devoured by this fungi, the seeds and the flowers. And here you can see my finger with the spores, and you can see the individual grains here or would have been there. So smuts, they're out there. Keep your eyes open for them. They're kind of cool. And there's the spores on my finger. There's going to be certain soil diseases, and these are going to be the Fusarium or verticillium wilts. And so you can see in the background here, we have a very healthy plant, and we can see here a plant that looks wilting and not happy. And so when we analyze it, here's a different plant that has been infected. Many orchards will take precautions, so they'll have some kind of lime or some kind of treatment that you can walk on, so make sure that you don't bring the pathogen from a different field. So don't be surprised if you're going to have to disinfect your feet. They also use some kind of grafting of resistant variety to fight off the disease. But even with the grafting, if there is a splash of water from the ground that happens to jump onto the stem, it could also affect it. So here's what's happening. So you have the graft here, and at some point, the fungus spore jumped or the infection jumped, and it's creating a canker, gradually killing the vascular system and the stem, preventing the water from reaching the top, and that's why it's causing some of those DC wilting symptoms. For here. So those are soil-borne, again, very difficult to control, water management, and that's about it, or using resistant variety or grafting, but those are very problematic. Now, right now, I've gotten several photographs of people sending me this. This is peach leaf curl. Peach leaf curl is not detrimental to peaches, but it's just going to deform the leaves. It's caused by a fungi. So here's just different shots of the leaf and different severity of infection. So it's out there. You might see it. Just be aware of that. And then there's also going to be gray molds. And gray molds are going to be lesser of an infection and more affecting very soft tissue. And so here we have a pansy, and we have some kind of damaged, broken leaf that serve as an entry point. And as the fungi grows and devours the plant, you can see the boundary where the healthy tissue is versus the one that's been eaten and affected versus the one that has already been killed. So soft tissue, here's a lettuce that was over water, not happy. Soft tissue got devoured by this gray mold. And in humid areas where you have a flower such as poinsettia that are grown in high humidity, if there is an infection with the gray mold, then it can affect the flowers. Eventually, if not treated, then it can kill the flowers and the leaves, and that is not a sellable product. So it can affect certain sensitive crops like this. And here's the lettuce once again. And this is where I took the magnification through with a microscope to show you the spores, bearing structure, and just the mycelium and everything else of the gray mold. Now, if we move to some of the viruses, plants have their own viruses. If you ever eat a papaya or if you let it get really old, you may see something like this. This is a papaya ring virus. And it causes this necrotic or dead areas that kind of create a nice circular pattern. And people can eat it. You can eat this papaya, not a problem. It's not going to affect you. But almost every papaya that comes into the US has this disease. So papaya ring virus. You may also have seen this heavily bamboo that has the red leaves. The red leaves are caused by a virus. So these are plants that are deliberately uh, infected. So most viruses on plants are not going to be detrimental. There's a few that have occurred in the tropics that devastated industry. So there was viruses that devastated bananas, viruses that devastated and killed coconuts and other tropical plants. But for the most part, viruses on plants are not going to be detrimental. They may cause some kind of problem, some kind of damage, some kind of distortion, some kind of weird color, as in the case of our heavily bamboo. And or with roses, it's going to create this yellowish pattern. So this is a virus. So what's important to note here is that the pattern on every single leaflet is going to be different. So there's no consistency. And it's going to be a little bit distorted and not as happy, look sick because the plant has a virus. So yeah, it has a reason to be sick. And so here is another leaf from a rose. And you see some leaflets that are smaller, some twisting, not happy, grotesque looking. It's a virus. Uh, there's a few other interesting diseases out there. This is a dieback on your ficus or figs, Cuban laurel fig. So you may go out into the city and see gigantic trees that die. Lakewood Boulevard used to have some magnificent individuals and now they're dead, now removed. But it is a combination of stress from being pruned and a disease from the soil. So it starts like this by decline and eventually an entire tree, it's gonna be dead. And so that's gonna happen. So it's a dieback on or a decline on Cuban laurel fig that's out there. And or you may see a new disease that is going to be known as pink rot on Canary Island palms. This is being transmitted through chainsaws. So when a grower, or sorry, somebody prunes an infected palm and they hop to the next one, they are then going to transmit the spores and infect the palm. And so you see a decline. So here's a happy, healthy palm. And here's one that is almost dead. And I think it's already gone by the time, but now. So one of the things that they have mandated is that people disinfect. You dip your chainsaw in bleach solution so that you disinfect it. Or better yet, you can use a handsaw, not a chainsaw, and disinfect your handsaw every single time. So it's affecting Canary Island palm, and next time you see somebody pruning in Canary Island palm, brace yourself because if they did not take the right precaution, they could infect it and it's going to die, and some of them could be quite large. And then we have fire blight. Again, I mentioned this one before. This one is affects pears and members of the rose family. So here's a tree. It's called fire blight because there is a rapid death on the stem, and it's going to die so quickly that leaves are not going to drop, and then you're going to have the flags or the dead branches that are going to linger on. And we see our life cycle here for fire blight. We can see that there's a canker where the pathogen overwinters, and during the right season, which is going to be the beginning of spring, the this is caused by a bacteria, first of all. The bacteria is going to ooze out of those cankers in a golden color, honey-like droplets. The droplets are going to attract bees, which they think it's honey. And once the bees begins to walk around and or eat this ooze, they're going to be completely infected with this bacteria. And then naturally, the bees are going to go onto flowers. They're going to collect the pollen and the nectar, and inevitably, the bees are going to put their foot on the nectar, which nectar is a sugary water that is perfect for bacteria to begin to grow. And then that's how the plant's going to be infected. Now, bacteria are not going to force their way into a plant. So most often, is if they happen to infect a plant, it's going to be through some kind of cut, pruning cut, or through some kind of natural opening. So in the case of fire blight, once the bee has put their foot on the nectar, then the bacteria is going to begin to reproduce. The bacteria will then use or enter the flower through the nectar glands. So those natural openings that are found on the flower that secrete the nectar, and it's going to make its way into the flower, eventually into the flower stem, and it's going to rapidly kill the tiny branch. Or if it happens to go into the main stem, it could kill the main stem, and eventually it may kill the entire tree. So this is where every single pear that is out in the city is already affected with it, and you will see it. So when you, next time you happen to be out and about in the city, just look around at the different types of pears and you'll see it. So the evergreen pear is the most susceptible. The Bradford pear is a little bit more resistant, but you'll still get it. So here is a bacteria that happens to be a serious problem. And here's the life cycle. And then we have a big problem with certain plants. This is olives, and olives have been declining for a while. So certain branches that have died, and eventually the entire tree will die. And that happened to be the pathogen named Xylella fastidiosa, which causes oleander scourge that is also affecting olives. So it started with oleanders, and it was noticed that every single branch in the plant looks happy except for one single branch in the middle. That is, looks kind of wilty, looks unhappy, and eventually that will die. So when we take a closer look, we can see beautiful leaves, and then attached to some of those branches were branches and leaves that were wilting. And so it did not make sense. As time went by, entire branches will die. And in a response from the dying branches, you will see shoots coming from the bottom, and eventually those will get infected as well. So they could not understand why, because they were trying to find a bacteria and nothing worked. They tried to find viruses and they couldn't find them. It just didn't make sense. It wasn't until later when they figured that this was a bacteria, but a bacteria that behaves like a virus. So, and that's why it made it difficult. And they also found the sharpshooter, or the glass-winged sharpshooter, which is this insect that you see here, that became the perfect vector. So prior to the introduction of this insect, there was no problem. The infection or the disease is native to California, but it wasn't affecting all of these other plants until this bigger, stronger insect was introduced from South, I think it was Mexico. So this became the perfect opportunity for the problem. So the vector, the individual organism that transmits the disease, is going to be the glass-winged sharpshooter. The infection or the pathogen is going to be the Xylella fastidiosa, or the scourge bacteria. And so what happens is that this brought new insight into a pathogen that affects the vascular system. So prior to this, they had no idea about vascular system or vascular infection. And so this new insect that has a longer mouth was able to probe through some of the bark and drink the sap from an infected plant. So as it feeds, it's going to absorb the bacteria. When it flies, the bacteria is going to continue to multiply in its mouth. And when the insect visits a healthy plant, it's going to infect it. And it's almost like a mosquito transmitting West Nile virus and a bunch of other diseases on human. But this isn't a plant, but it is behaving the same way. And so as the bacteria then gets deposited into the vascular system, it begins to multiply even more. And so later on, the number of bacteria that grown so huge is going to literally block the vascular system. So this became a vascular infection. And so clogging the vascular system of the plant prevents the water from reaching the leaves. And that is why you have the same symptoms as a plant that is suffering from water stress. And so here is the xylem that would normally be open for water that is now completely blocked. And so this is also known as a fastidious bacteria because it was very difficult to plate it out and figure out what it was. It was a bacteria, but it just requires certain specific media for it to be cultivated. And so it's a fastidious bacteria. It's a vascular clogging bacteria. It's a big problem. So here's some of the symptoms of the scorch disease. So scorch, burning of the leaves, chlorosis, meaning it kind of looks yellowish of color, stunning because it's not going to grow, and then it declines. Eventually, the entire stem will die, and the plant is going to have some new shoots. Here is some of the different strains. So later on, as more research was done, they found that there is not just one strain of the bacteria. There are several of them. First one was blamed, but later on, nope, there's many of them out there. And they were causing different problems. And here's the real frightening thing, is that it affects every single plant as long as it gets infected. So it's not specific to anything. And every single year we're finding new plants that are gonna be now infected with this. And so it started with oleander, and then it moved to olives, and then American sweet gum, and then magnolias, and a bunch of other things. So here is just a list of a partial list of plants that have been sampled and found this bacteria inside them. So that was frightening. Now we have some kind of cankers, so dead areas that are going to harbor some of the diseases. And so here we see a nice stem, and you can see a disease that is coming out there. So this is a canker. Here you can see where it's just spewing with bacteria and all the pathogen out of it. And here you can see some more. So this is an area that it has died, and the bacteria, the fungi, the organism is still living inside. Very common to see it with American sweet gum, and you can also smell it. So next time you buy an American sweet gum, just take a time and smell it, and you can see some kind of bleeding, some kind of oozing. So it's a dead area that is still actively with the pathogen. Or you can see some galls and grotesque tumors on plants, but because plants have an open system, it's not detrimental. Unlike humans, we have a closed system. And so you might see stems that got infected by a bacteria. This is a bacteria that forces the cells to multiply and expand and create these tumors. And not detrimental. You might find them on the ground afflicting the stem or even the roots. So you can see all these tumors. Or you might find them on the leaves. Now, when you find them on the leaves, they are not caused by a bacteria so much, but by insects. So there are going to be certain insects, certain wasps that have a relationship with the plant, where the wasp is going to land on the leaf. They're going to lay the eggs inside the leaves, and they're going to spray or add a hormone that will cause the cells in the surrounding area to multiply and expand like a tumor or like a wart. It is within this tissue that the baby wasps that were laid are going to feed on. And so the baby wasp will be happily inside, eating and feeding, growing. And then as they get older, they will then find a way out or chew a way out. So here's some beautiful, colorful galls on some of the other plants. And here's some more right here. And there's some more galls. And so here's a nice gall or the top side. And here's one that where there is a hole now, so that organism, insect, happen to now be out, and it's an adult. And here's the hole where it chew its way or its way out of freedom. And then we have aloe gall, and this is not caused by a pathogen, it's caused by a mite. So this is a quiver tree or aloe, and you can see all of this grotesque growth. And right now, if you go to almost any aloe out there, you're probably going to see it. So it's just the constant feeding on the mites that distorts the stems and causes some of this grotesque growth on the plant. You see it right there. Or I'm going to caution you with certain things that may look like a pathogen, but they're not. So here's rosemary, and we have a tiny piece or a new shoot that is mutated, where it's not able to cause or create chlorophyll. And so it's going to appear as white because that's the color of plants. Well, actually, they're color green when they have chlorophyll, but if they're not able to produce chlorophyll, then they're going to be whitish or yellowish. And so this is just a mutation. It happens to people as well when there's unable to produce some of the pigment, and you see some spots that are darker or lighter in color. So just cut this branch, it's fine, nothing's going to happen. And some of them are going to be selected for being variegated. So here I visited a home of a person who loves variegated plants. So here's an agave that ideally should be greener, but it's a selection that has lighter color and unable to produce chlorophyll. So just be careful to not confuse a disease for a natural selection of a plant or some kind of mutation or something else. Here's even our not foxtail, but our asparagus that has some of the variegation, so the lighter color, not a disease. Here's even palms that have yellow stripes. Again, variegation, not a disease, just a mutation. And even some of our clivias that may have, and bromelias that may have some variegation or some off color. So make sure that you are, be careful and not confuse diseases with something that is going to be natural. And so with that, I will post this, and I will also have some photographs of the diseases. So from now on, we are going to not require for you to submit the samples. I will provide you with the samples so that you can study them, become familiar with them, and when it's necessary, you will know what people are going to be talking about. So we're going to forego you looking for the samples because I understand not all of you are able to go out or want to go out. So I will provide you with that information. Just study them, become familiar with them. Take care. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.